When you think of the Roaring '20s, you probably picture jazz clubs, flappers, and just this booming sense of prosperity. But that's really only half the story. The decade didn't start with a party. It started with the end of one war and the beginning of another. A war America was fighting against itself.
It's a pretty big question, right? The Great War was finally over. The soldiers were coming home. But instead of peace, the country just kind of exploded. It was one of the most violent years in our history. So, what on earth was going on?
Okay, the best way to think about it is like this. Picture a neighborhood that's just been through some huge disaster. Everyone's on edge, supplies are running low, prices for everything are through the roof, and people are starting to get really suspicious of each other. That was America. You had soldiers coming home desperate for jobs, inflation making everyday life impossible, and this deep, dark fear of foreign ideas just poisoning everything.
And all that tension, it all boiled over in one single absolutely chaotic year, 1919. It was basically a three-way collision between huge conflicts over labor, race, and ideology. And man, just look at this timeline. It shows you just how relentless the year was. It kicks off with a strike that shuts down an entire city, Seattle. Then it explodes into horrible racial violence all summer. And get this, by September, even the Boston police force was on strike, leading to total chaos. These weren't just random events. This was the entire country convulsing. The sheer scale of the labor strikes was just mind-blowing. 4 million workers walked off the job that year. To put that in perspective, that's about 1 out of every 5 industrial workers in the entire country. After all the sacrifices they made during the war, they were fed up, and they were demanding better pay, shorter workdays, and just the basic right to form a union. Now, that strike in Seattle was especially scary for the people in power because it was a general strike. That means it wasn't just, one group of workers from one factory. It was pretty much the entire city's workforce walking out together in solidarity. To a lot of Americans, this didn't look like a simple labor dispute. It looked like the beginning of a revolution. So, how did big business react? They fought back, and they fought back hard. They came up with something they called the American Plan. Sounds pretty patriotic, right? But its real goal was to absolutely crush unions. It pushed for what's called an open shop, which meant you didn't have to join a union to get a job. And that just totally shattered the power of workers to bargain together. And what was the result of all this? Well, this table tells the whole story. Just look at that outcome column. Collapsed, fired, failed. The strikes were systematically broken one by one. But the real secret weapon is in that last column. They turned public perception against the workers, painting them not as hardworking people but as dangerous, un-American radicals. And this idea was perfectly captured by the governor of Massachusetts at the time, Calvin Coolidge. When the Boston police went on strike, he fired every single one of them and became a national hero for it. His famous line was, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." The message couldn't have been clearer. Law and order came first, and workers' rights were a distant second. Okay, so at the exact same time all this was happening with the unions, the country was also tangled up in 2 other massive crises: a paranoid fear of communism and an absolutely brutal wave of racial violence. It was called the Red Summer. And that's not a reference to communism. It was about the blood that was spilled on the streets. That summer, racial violence just erupted in 36 different cities across the United States. And the absolute worst of it was in Chicago. It all started at a segregated beach with the tragic death of a young black teenager. What followed was a solid week of rioting that left 38 people dead. It was just horrific. So, why was this all happening? Well, it was like a perfect storm of tension. On one hand, you had the Great Migration, hundreds of thousands of Black Americans moving north for jobs, which created new competition and friction in cities. And at the exact same time, Black soldiers were returning from Europe after fighting a war for democracy, only to find zero democracy waiting for them back home. They came back with a new sense of pride and a new willingness to fight for their rights. And swirling around all of this chaos was something called the First Red Scare. After the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, America became terrified of a communist takeover. The government, especially Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, started seeing radicals behind every corner. He launched these infamous Palmer raids, arresting thousands, mostly immigrants and leftists, often with no warrants, no evidence, no due process. It created this climate of absolute fear. So what happens when a country goes through all this chaos and fear? You get a backlash, a huge, powerful, conservative backlash. As many Americans saw the world spinning out of control, their solution was to build walls, both literally and figuratively.
Part of this backlash was the terrifying rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. And this wasn't just a Southern thing anymore. This new KKK exploded in popularity across the North and the Midwest. By 1924, it had 5 million members. And their list of enemies got a lot longer, too. It wasn't just anti-Black anymore. Now it was also fiercely anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, and anti-immigrant. They were selling this vision of a pure, white, Protestant America.
And that fear of outsiders got written directly into the law. In 1921, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act to set the first real limits on immigration. But that wasn't enough for them. So in 1924, they brought down the hammer with the National Origins Act. This law basically slammed the door shut, and it was specifically designed to keep out people from Southern and Eastern Europe, and it banned immigrants from Asia entirely. The walls were officially going up. But here's the thing about building walls. It always creates a pushback, and that's exactly what happened. As the traditionalists tried to lock things down, a new, modern, urban America began to rebel, creating the central fight of the Roaring '20s.
And this chart, man, this really shows you the two Americas at war with each other. On one side, you have traditionalist America, rural, deeply religious, supporters of Prohibition, and deeply suspicious of anyone new. On the other side, you have modernist America, urban, more secular, opposed to Prohibition, and embracing cultural diversity. The whole decade was basically a giant tug of war between these two ideas.
And you know who was leading the charge for the modernists? The new woman. She finally got the right to vote in 1920, and her influence just exploded. The ultimate symbol was the flopper, cutting her hair short, raising her hemlines, and demanding a new kind of social and personal freedom. And this was way more than just a fashion trend. It was a direct challenge to centuries of tradition, and it terrified conservatives.
At the same time, another rebellion was taking place. In the face of all that intense racism, the new Negro movement emerged with the Harlem Renaissance at its heart. This wasn't about asking for equality. It was about declaring it. It was this incredible, proactive celebration of Black art, Black culture, and Black intellect. It created a whole new sense of racial pride, and it absolutely laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement that would come later.
So with all this conflict, you've got to wonder, right? What kept the country from just completely tearing itself apart? Well, for most of the decade, the answer was pretty simple: money. The economy was roaring, and as long as people felt prosperous, the deep cultural cracks could be papered over. But that tension, it was always there, simmering right below the surface. And that really brings us to the final thought here. Think about it. A deep culture war between urban and rural values. Fear of radical new ideas and foreign influence, bitter, angry debates about who gets to be an American. The conflicts of the 1920s really did set the stage for the rest of the century. And when you look around today, you have to ask yourself, are we still on it?